Today isn't about fixing what's broken. It's about remembering what's powerful. Lasting change doesn't begin in your environment, your schedule, or other people's behavior. It begins in the invisible place, your inner world. When your inner world changes, your outer world must follow. Awareness is the first moment where real freedom begins, because without it, everything you do is automatic. Most people believe they are making choices, yet they are simply repeating patterns that were formed years ago. Thinking the same thoughts, which lead to the same emotions, which drive the same behaviors, and at the end of the day, they wonder why nothing has shifted. This loop feels familiar, and familiarity often disguises itself as comfort. Even when it no longer serves you, awareness interrupts that loop. The instant you notice what you are thinking while you are thinking it, you are no longer trapped inside it. You have stepped outside the program. For many, this moment is uncomfortable. Becoming aware means seeing yourself clearly without excuses and without blame. It means recognizing how often your thoughts drift to worry, how quickly you react emotionally, and how frequently your attention is pulled back into memories of the past. Discomfort is not a problem. It is a signal that change has become possible. You cannot transform what remains unconscious. The habits that run your life thrive in darkness. Awareness shines a light. What is illuminated can no longer control you in the same way. When you begin observing your inner world, you realize how rarely you are truly present. Much of the time, the body is here, but the mind is somewhere else, replaying old experiences or anticipating future problems. This mental time travel keeps you anchored to familiar emotional states. Awareness brings you back into the present moment where real power exists. Present is the only place where new choices can be made. Every time you notice that your mind has wandered into an old story and gently bring it back, you weaken the grip of that story. Awareness is not about judging yourself or trying to force change. Judgment only reinforces the same emotional patterns you are trying to outgrow. Instead, awareness is a calm, curious observation. It is watching your reactions as if you were studying them for the first time. Why does this situation trigger frustration? That comment create anxiety. When you ask these questions without trying to fix anything, something remarkable happens. The emotional charge begins to dissolve. The nervous system starts to regulate. The body feels safer simply because it is being noticed rather than driven. As awareness deepens, you begin to see that your thoughts are not facts, they are habits. Many of them were learned through repetition, environment, and experience. When you stop identifying with every thought, you reclaim your ability to choose which ones deserve your attention. This is where freedom truly begins. You are no longer compelled to believe every narrative your mind produces. You can pause, breathe, decide whether a thought aligns with the future you want to create. This pause may feel small, but it is powerful. In that space between stimulus and response, a new version of you can emerge. Instead of reacting automatically, you respond intentionally. Reinforcing the past, you open the door to something new. Over time, these pauses add up. Awareness becomes less of an effort and more of a state of being. You start noticing subtle shifts in how you speak, how you listen, how you move through your day. Awareness also reconnects you with your body. Emotions leave signatures in the nervous system, and many people carry stress so long that it feels normal. When you become aware of physical sensations, tension, breathing patterns, you begin to decode the message your body has been sending all along. The body is always in the present moment, and when you bring conscious attention to it, the mind naturally follows. This coherence between mind and body creates stability, clarity, and a sense of inner control. With sustained awareness, you realize that change does not require force. It requires presence. The more present you become, the less power old patterns have over you. Awareness transforms unconscious habits into conscious choices, and conscious choices gradually reshape identity. You begin to sense that you are no longer defined by past reactions or conditioned responses, but by your capacity to observe, pause, choose differently in each moment, allowing new possibilities to emerge through attention, intention, and a growing familiarity with the present moment where your energy is no longer scattered, but gently gathered, ready to be directed towards something new. Every thought you think is a signal, and most people underestimate how powerful that signal truly is. Thoughts are not passive or harmless, they are instructions. When a thought is repeated often enough, it begins to carve a pathway in the mind. Pathway becomes the route the brain prefers to travel. Over time, what began as a single idea turns into a mental habit. Those habits quietly shape how you perceive the world, how you interpret events, and how you respond to life. Long before circumstances change on the outside, they have already been rehearsed on the inside through repeated thinking. Many people attempt to change their lives while holding on to the same internal dialogue. They want new outcomes. They continue to think in the same familiar ways. The mind keeps returning to worry, doubt, comparison, or limitation because those thoughts feel known. Familiar thoughts create familiar emotions, and familiar emotions reinforce familiar behaviors. Cycle is so endless that it feels like reality rather than a pattern. Yet the moment you recognize that your thoughts are shaping your future, responsibility returns to you, not as a burden, but as an opportunity. Every thought carries an emotional charge. Charge conditions the body. When you think thoughts rooted in fear, the body prepares for threat. When you think thoughts rooted in possibility, the body shifts toward openness and creativity. The body does not question these signals, responds automatically. This is why repeated thinking becomes embodied. Over time, the body begins to expect certain emotional states, and it subtly influences the mind to think in ways that keep those states alive. This is how people become anchored to versions of themselves without realizing how it happened. To change the future, you must interrupt this process at the level of thought. This does not mean suppressing thoughts or fighting them. Resistance only gives them more energy. Change begins with noticing the quality of your inner dialogue. Are your thoughts aligned with growth or with protection? Are they rooted in the past or oriented toward possibility? Each time you become aware of a limiting thought and choose not to follow it, you weaken its influence. Each time you intentionally introduce a new thought, you begin laying a different mental foundation. The brain is constantly reorganizing itself based on what you focus on most, what you repeatedly think about, you repeatedly wire. When you consistently choose thoughts that reflect who you want to become, the brain starts to map that future as if it already exists. It is not imagination for escape, it is mental rehearsal for transformation. As these new thoughts are practiced, they begin to feel more natural, and the old ones start to lose their emotional intensity. The future becomes more familiar than the past. Process requires patience and persistence because the mind will often pull you back to what it knows. The old self is efficient. It has rehearsed those thoughts thousands of times. The new self feels unfamiliar, and unfamiliarity can feel unsafe at first. Every time you choose a thought that reflects clarity, confidence, or intention, you're casting a vote for a different identity. Identity is not fixed. It is constructed moment by moment through repeated mental choices. As your thinking changes, your perception shifts. You begin to notice opportunities that were always present but previously filtered out. You respond differently to the same situations, not because the situation changed, but because the observer changed. How internal change precedes external results. When your thoughts are no longer dominated by survival or limitation, your actions naturally follow a different rhythm. You speak differently, you decide differently, you carry yourself differently without forcing it. Over time, new thoughts lead to new emotional states, and those emotional states reinforce the new thoughts. This upward cycle replaces the old one. Future you once for becomes something you are mentally and emotionally prepared to live. What once required effort becomes familiar. The blueprint you repeatedly impressed upon your mind begins to express itself through behavior, relationships, and choices. Inner architecture continues to organize itself around what you consistently think, feel, and believe about what is possible for you now. Emotions are not random experiences that happen to you. They are signals that shape how your body lives and learns. Every emotion you feel sends a chemical message throughout your system, instructing your cells how to respond. When an emotion is felt once, it passes. When it is felt repeatedly, it becomes familiar. Over time, familiarity turns into a baseline. Body begins to accept that emotional state as normal, even when it is rooted in stress, frustration, or fear. This is how emotional patterns quietly become biological patterns. The body is always listening to the mind, understands emotion more clearly than words. You can say you want change, growth, or peace, but if your emotional state is dominated by urgency, resistance, or doubt, the body believes the emotion, not the intention. Emotion is the language that bridges thought and physiology. When the same emotions are experienced day after day, the body memorizes them. It begins to crave them, not because they feel good, but because they feel familiar. How people become emotionally conditioned to the past. Many individuals live their lives reacting emotionally to circumstances without realizing that those reactions are reinforcing internal states. A stressful event triggers a familiar emotional response. Response strengthens the body's attachment to stress. Over time, the body begins to anticipate these emotions and subtly influences perception to recreate them. This creates a feedback loop where emotions drive thoughts, drive more of the same emotions. Breaking this loop does not begin by changing the world outside. It begins by changing how you feel inside. When you intentionally generate a new emotional state, You interrupt the body's expectation. Emotions such as gratitude, appreciation, inspiration, or compassion are not dependent on circumstances, they are internal skills. When practiced consistently, they send a powerful signal to the body that it is safe, supported, and open to growth. The system begins to shift out of survival mode. Hormonal balance changes. The body stops preparing for threat and starts preparing for creation. This shift may feel unnatural at first. The body is accustomed to certain chemical patterns. Stepping into a new emotional state can feel unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. This discomfort is not a sign that something is wrong. It is evidence that the body is learning a new language. Time you remain present with an elevated emotion without needing an external reason, you teach the body that it no longer needs past conditions to define how it feels. As these new emotions are practiced, the body begins to trust them. Respond differently. Energy is conserved instead of depleted. Mental clarity improves. Emotional resilience strengthens. The body moves out of reaction and into regulation. This is not a mental exercise alone, it is a full body experience. When emotion changes, when perception changes, behavior naturally follows. Sustained emotional change creates coherence between the heart and the brain. In this state, internal signals become organized rather than chaotic. Decisions feel clearer. Responses become intentional rather than impulsive. You are no longer driven by emotional reflexes shaped by the past, but guided by emotional states aligned with the future you want to experience. Coherence allows the body to work with the mind instead of against it. As the body learns new emotional patterns, it stops demanding the old ones. The urge to react diminishes. The need for external validation softens. You begin to experience a sense of inner stability that is not dependent on outcomes. From this state, you are no longer controlled by what happens around you. You become the source of your emotional state rather than the effect of your environment. Over time, elevated emotions become traits rather than temporary states. What you once had to practice becomes who you are. The body no longer resists change because it feels safe in the present moment. When the body is no longer anchored to the chemistry of the past, it becomes available for new experiences, new behaviors, and new levels of awareness, allowing emotion to guide biology into a state of balance, adaptability, and readiness for transformation without waiting for the external world to give permission. People believe they want change, yet they continue to protect the version of themselves that was created by past experiences. This attachment is subtle and often invisible. It lives in emotional reactions, familiar stories, habitual responses that feel like identity. Even when those patterns cause discomfort, they provide a sense of predictability. The known, even when painful, can feel safer than the unknown. This is how the old self maintains control, not through logic. Through emotional familiarity, the personality you express every day is built from repeated thoughts, emotions, and behaviors. Over time, this combination becomes automatic. You no longer decide who you are in each moment. You simply remember yourself. Remembered self is efficient, but it is also limiting. When you attempt to change, the body and mind resist because change threatens the emotional homeostasis they have learned to rely on. The resistance you feel is not failure. It is conditioning pushing back. Play a central role in keeping the old self alive. Reactions such as anger, guilt, fear, or sadness become chemically rewarding to the body through repetition. The body begins to crave these states not because they are healthy, because they are familiar. When you try to let go of them, the body signals discomfort, restlessness, or anxiety. This is often misinterpreted as something going wrong, when in reality, it is the body detoxing from emotional patterns it has depended on for years. Breaking free requires willingness to sit in that discomfort without escaping it. The moment you stop reacting in the usual way, the old self begins to weaken. When you pause instead of exploding, observe instead of blaming, breathe instead of distracting yourself, you are erupting the emotional supply that keeps that identity alive. This moment feels unstable because you are no longer who you were, but not yet who you are becoming. This space can feel empty, but it is also full of potential. People abandon change at this stage because the discomfort feels unfamiliar and the old patterns promise relief. Returning to old reactions provides instant chemical comfort, reinforcing the belief that change is difficult or unsustainable. Yet every time you choose to remain conscious through discomfort, you prove to yourself that you are not your emotions. You are the awareness experiencing them. This distinction is where freedom begins to take root. As you repeatedly refuse to feed the emotions of the past, the body begins to recalibrate. The intensity of urges decreases. The mind becomes quieter. The emotional charge around old triggers weakens. This is not suppression. It is transformation. You are not pushing emotions away. You are allowing them to complete their cycle without identifying with them. In doing so, The old self no longer has the energy required to survive. Letting go of the old self also means releasing the stories you tell about who you are and why things happen to you. These narratives often justify emotional reactions and reinforce identity. When you stop rehearsing them, the mind initially searches for meaning, for explanation for something familiar to hold on to. Remaining present during this phase allows a new internal order to emerge without forcing it into old frameworks. With time and consistency, a shift occurs. The discomfort that once felt overwhelming becomes manageable. The new state begins to feel more natural than the old one. You start responding instead of reacting. You notice space between thoughts. You experience moments of calm without a reason. These are signs that the old self is losing dominance and a new internal organization is forming. This process is not about becoming someone else, it is about removing what no longer belongs. When the emotional addiction to the past dissolves, energy becomes available for creativity, clarity, and intention. The body no longer pulls you back into familiar reactions because it no longer needs them to feel safe. In that freedom, you begin to act from choice rather than conditioning, allowing a new sense of identity to stabilize as the old one fades, moment by moment, through conscious presence and the courage to remain with the unknown while the familiar quietly releases its hold. The mind is constantly preparing for what it expects next. At the time, it does this unconsciously. It rehearses problems before they happen, imagines conversations that may never occur, and anticipates outcomes based on past experiences. Kind of mental rehearsal conditions the body to live in anticipation of familiar futures. When the future is imagined through the lens of the past, the body responds as if nothing new is possible. The nervous system prepares for what it already knows. The cycle continues without conscious choice. Yet the same mechanism that keeps people stuck is also the mechanism that allows transformation. The brain does not clearly distinguish between an experience that is vividly imagined and one that is physically lived. When you mentally rehearse a future with intention, emotion, and clarity, the brain begins to wire itself as if that future is already unfolding. Neural networks organize around what you repeatedly imagine, and the body starts to respond to those signals. This is how the internal state begins to align with a future that has not yet occurred. Most people wait for external evidence before allowing themselves to feel differently. They wait for success before feeling confident, for resolution before feeling calm, for validation before feeling worthy. This reinforces the idea that emotion is an effect rather than a cause. Mental rehearsal reverses this pattern. You begin by choosing how you want to think, feel, and act before the environment changes. In doing so, you train the body to become familiar with a new way of being ahead of time. At first, this practice can feel artificial. The mind may resist, reminding you of past failures or current limitations. This resistance is not a sign that the process is ineffective, a sign that the old identity is being challenged. The body is accustomed to certain emotional states, and rehearsing a new future introduces unfamiliar signals. Remaining present with this unfamiliarity teaches the body that it can survive without the past defining the future. Effective mental rehearsal is not passive daydreaming. It is an intentional process of embodying a future self. You see yourself responding differently in situations that once triggered automatic reactions. You imagine yourself speaking with clarity instead of hesitation, choosing patience instead of frustration, confidence instead of doubt. As you do this, you allow yourself to feel the emotions associated with those responses. Emotion is what signals the body that the experience is real. With repetition, these imagined experiences begin to feel more natural. The emotional charge around them stabilizes. The body starts to recognize these states as safe and familiar. When a real-life situation arises that resembles what you have rehearsed, the body no longer panics or reverts to old habits. It responds according to what it has practiced. The future no longer feels foreign because it has already been lived internally many times. This process also builds trust in yourself. Each rehearsal reinforces the belief that you are capable of responding differently. You are no longer relying on willpower in the moment, you are relying on preparation. The gap between intention and action narrows. Choices become easier because they are no longer new. They have been rehearsed, felt, integrated at a neurological and emotional level. Mental rehearsal gradually shifts identity. You begin to associate yourself with the future you are practicing rather than the past you are trying to escape. This shift is subtle but powerful. You carry yourself changes. Your posture, tone, and attention reflects someone who expects alignment rather than resistance. This expectation influences how others respond to you and how opportunities present themselves. As the inner rehearsal continues, external world begins to reflect it, not through force, but through coherence. When thoughts, emotions, and actions are aligned with a clear internal vision, behavior naturally follows. You notice yourself making choices that support the future you've been practicing without needing to analyze them. The body moves toward what it recognizes. Over time, the future you once imagined no longer feels like a destination. It feels like a direction you are already moving in. The rehearsal becomes less deliberate because the state has become familiar. What began as a conscious practice evolves into a way of being. Mind and body are no longer waiting for permission from circumstances. They are already prepared, already aligned, already responding from a version of you that has been lived internally again and again until the distinction between imagination and experience begins to dissolve and the future starts to feel present within the rhythm of your thoughts, emotions, choices as they continue to organize around what you have repeatedly practiced from within. Consistency is the invisible force that transforms intention into reality, and yet it is often overlooked because it rarely produces dramatic results overnight. True change is rarely born from a single inspired moment. It is the accumulation of small, deliberate actions repeated over time. Every time you make a conscious choice instead of reacting unconsciously, every time you pause instead of reacting impulsively, you align your thoughts and emotions with a new way of being. You are reinforcing a pattern that slowly rewires your mind and body. Consistency is not about perfection. It is about persistence and the quiet, steady application of your attention toward the person you wish to become. Most people underestimate how much repetition shapes identity. The mind and body are designed to automate behaviors to conserve energy. This is why habits form so quickly, positive and negative. Every repeated thought, emotion, or action strengthens neural pathways, making that pattern easier to access in the future. Conversely, every time you consistently choose a new thought, a new emotional state, or a new behavior, you are creating a new pathway. Over time, this pathway becomes familiar and the new behavior begins to feel automatic. It is no longer a struggle, it becomes a part of who you are. Consistency also creates trust between your mind and body. When you regularly practice awareness, emotional regulation, and intentional action, your nervous system begins to predict and accept these new patterns. The body learns that it can rely on your attention rather than being hijacked by past conditioning. Each repeated choice builds confidence in your ability to act differently. The more the body experiences the new state, the less it resists, and the easier it becomes to sustain transformation. Change is no longer a battle, it becomes a rhythm. Small, intentional acts repeated accumulate into monumental shifts. It is easy to overlook them because they may not produce immediate dramatic outcomes, but the compound effect is undeniable. Each conscious thought, each mindful response, each emotionally coherent moment strengthens the internal architecture of your being. Over months and years, these repeated choices solidify into automatic ways of thinking and feeling, and eventually they shape identity. Identity is not something static, a collection of repeated experiences. By consistently choosing differently, you are reshaping that collection moment by moment. Consistency also develops resilience. The mind and body are trained by repetition to endure challenges and maintain coherence. When an unexpected situation arises, the behaviors and emotional states you have rehearsed become your default. Without consistency, the old patterns return quickly because they are familiar. With consistency, the new patterns hold even under pressure. This is how transformation becomes durable, not temporary. The internal structure has been fortified through repeated experience, and the old ways no longer have the same authority. The emotional component of consistency is equally important. Each time you practice a new emotional response, you are signaling to the body that it is safe to exist in that state. Over time, these new emotional patterns become traits rather than temporary moods. You stop relying on external events to dictate how you feel because your internal system has been trained to produce elevated states consistently. When emotional states are repeated and integrated, they become a natural part of identity and influence thought and behavior without conscious effort. Consistency is also the bridge between imagination and experience. It is not enough to envision a new way of being or to feel elevated emotions sporadically. Repetition solidifies the vision into reality. The brain and body need repeated signals to accept the new patterns as normal. Every consistent moment reinforces the neural and emotional architecture of transformation, strengthening the likelihood that the new state will persist even when external circumstances challenge it. Through repetition, what once felt impossible becomes familiar, comfortable, and automatic. Over time, consistency produces a powerful internal momentum. Identity you are constructing begins to support itself. Thoughts, emotions, and behaviors align more naturally, reducing resistance and increasing flow. The internal organization becomes coherent, allowing the mind and body to operate in harmony rather than conflict. This momentum continues to grow as long as attention is applied intentionally, creating a foundation for transformation that is not dependent on motivation, willpower, or circumstance. Instead arises from the repeated practice of conscious, aligned living by day, moment by moment, building the structure of who you are at the deepest level. When you change from the inside out, the world around you responds naturally. For a struggle. Most people approach life as though external circumstances must shift first in order for them to feel different, to act differently, or to experience more. They believe that opportunity, relationships, or success are contingent upon conditions outside themselves. Yet the truth is that life mirrors your internal state. Your outer world cannot reflect possibilities you have not yet embodied within. Transformation begins not in action, but in alignment. When your thoughts, emotions, and intentions are coherent, your external reality starts to reorganize around the state of being you have cultivated internally. Every choice you make internally sends a signal outward. Thoughts align with clarity, focus, possibility communicate a different energy than thoughts anchored in fear, doubt, or limitation. Repeatedly holding these elevated internal states begins to attract circumstances and people that resonate with the same frequency. The universe, or your perception of it, responds to the coherence between your inner mind and your emotions. You stop pushing against life and begin moving with it. And as a result, opportunities that once seemed distant or impossible now appear more naturally. Changing internally first also transforms how you respond to external events. When the internal observer shifts, the outer world loses its power to trigger old emotional reactions. Situations that previously caused frustration, fear, no longer have the same hold over you. Your responses are intentional rather than reactive. You act from a place of presence rather than compulsion. This is why people who cultivate internal transformation report that life itself seems to change. Because circumstances have magically altered, but because they perceive, interpret, and respond to the same events differently. Their internal coherence reorganizes external patterns in ways that reflect the new self. Relationships also shift when internal alignment occurs. When you operate from an internally stable and elevated state, the dynamics with others change. You no longer attract or respond to the same conflicts and dramas because your emotional and mental energy communicates a different expectation. Others sense your presence, and your interactions evolve in response. External environment adjusts not through effort or manipulation, but through resonance. The state you embody internally becomes the gravitational center around which your life begins to reorganize. Opportunities begin to align with the inner transformation as well. When thoughts, emotions, and actions are coherent, decision-making becomes clearer, creativity increases, and intuition strengthens. You notice possibilities that were previously invisible. You are able to act on them with confidence. Timing seems to shift in your favor, not because the world bends to your will, but because you have prepared yourself internally to recognize and step into alignment with the opportunities that already exist. The inner work cultivates readiness, which the outer world cannot help but reflect. External change is amplified by the integration of elevated emotions and focused intention. When you consistently generate feelings of gratitude, inspiration, and possibility, physiology begins to match your intentions. The body, no longer tethered to fear or stress, operates with clarity and coherence. This alignment between mind and body produces actions that are consistent with your internal vision. Actions compound over time. They influence circumstances, relationships, and opportunities, creating a feedback loop in which internal coherence generates external results that reinforce the internal state. Also brings freedom from past conditioning. When you are no longer anchored to familiar emotional responses or habitual thinking, you are able to see life with fresh eyes. The outer world is no longer imprinted through the lens of limitation or past identity. Events are experienced as they are, and responses emerge from clarity rather than automatic reaction. This new internal perspective subtly, yet powerfully, reorganizes life around possibility rather than restriction. The external reorganization is not something you control through force. It is a natural outcome of internal alignment. Life begins to reflect the energy, clarity, and coherence you cultivate within. Patterns of opportunity, relationships, and experiences shift in resonance with the new internal state. The more consistently you maintain elevated thoughts, emotions, and intentions, the more your environment mirrors the transformation already completed inside, creating a seamless flow between who you are internally and what life presents externally as alignment becomes the standard through which all experiences are filtered. Respond in the version of you that has already begun to live in the future through conscious presence, elevated emotion, and deliberate intention. Lasting change is not about becoming someone new. It's about unbecoming what no longer serves you. When you change from the inside out, you don't just improve your life, you create a new one.